Hello, and welcome to episode 25 of Airs for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. In this episode, I speak with Dean Hawkes, Emeritus Professor of Architecture at the University of Cambridge, about his book, The Architect and the Academy, Essays on Research and Environment, published by Routledge in 2022, and the second edition of its influential and important work, The Environmental Imagination, Techniques and Poetics of the Architectural Environment, published in 2019, also by Routledge.
If the environment within the building is a product of a transaction between outside and inside, we're essentially filtering, a term I've used in the past, selecting those aspects of the external environment which are desirable to have in your house, such as a patch of sunlight or bright natural light, a waft of gentle air from an open window, whatever it might be, even bird song from your garden entering the inside. If we eliminate all of those, we're depriving ourselves of a sensory connection with nature, which I think is very fundamental to human well-being.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome again to Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Dean Hawkes. Professor Dean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. I think the best way to describe myself is I've been a teacher and researcher and practitioner of architecture for over half a century. And for 30 years, I taught in the School of Architecture in Cambridge. That was from 1965 to 1995, when I moved to the Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff as Professor of Architectural Design, where I remained till 2002, when I retired and came back to Cambridge, where my wife had remained whilst I was at Cardiff in the house I built in 1991. And I rejoined my Cambridge College, Darwin College, as a fellow. And I continue to work now in Cambridge, teaching and writing from the study that I built at the end of the garden of that 1991 house.
So what's your 1991 house like? Who inspired that?
The need to build a house for two middle-aged people, I think. How to describe it? I tend to feel that when it comes to one's own architecture, descriptions are difficult. It's kind of what it is. It arose out of our particular needs. Our children had grown up, left home. They're of that generation who went to university and didn't come back after university. They went out into the world. So essentially we built a house in middle age just for two people, both of whom worked at the time, and a place in which to spend the rest of our lives.
That's a lovely idea.
Then subsequently, of course, after I retired, the house needed to be extended a little bit because, partly because the library had expanded to the point that it wouldn't fit into the numerous bookcases in the house. So I effectively built, as you can see, I'm in at the end of the garden now. I built a bookcase in the garden and wrapped a little building around it, in which to put myself as well as the books.
I'm glad to see that your shelves behind you are bowing like mine are. It's a consistent thing.
Books do this.
But
the house, it comes out of my architectural interests in the broadest sense, and to some extent it could be seen as an expression of those interests. As you know, I've worked for many years in the area of environment in the broadest definitions in architecture, and the house might be characterized as a passive solar house. This morning, we had breakfast in a tall bay window facing south, with the temperature at 3 degrees outside, sun shining, and no heat in the house.
That sounds pretty.
But it's
pretty...
more than a technical object. It's a house.
Yes. Well, the reason I ask that is I was looking through this morning. I was looking through the re-edition of The Environmental Imagination, which we're going to talk about, and in the news section on Louis Barragan,
Mm-hmm.
In the postscript of it, you have a quote from Louis Kahn talking about Barragan's house in Mexico City, and
Yes,
he says,
yes.
Kahn says about Barragan's house, his house is not merely a house, but house itself. And I was just wondering, is your house itself?
I mean, yes. I mean, it was built as a place in which to live, not as a piece of architecture.
Uh-huh.
It may be a piece of architecture, but I think that's for other people to judge.
Well, this is quite interesting. So it goes into this thing around Louis Barragan, because you document the way that it shifted over time. You know, it's a perfect piece of architecture that has been shifted and lived in. And I think that's really interesting. But I want to come... So obviously The Environmental Imagination is an important book, and it's a beautifully written book. And in a way it's a little bit controversial, I suppose, in that you habilitate the masters of modernism through a perspective of environmentalism, which I was reading that Architects Journal yesterday, and they talk about net zero, and there was an article saying less than 50% of architects have designed a net zero house in the last year, or a net zero building or something, which was seen as being a bad thing. And it raises all sorts of interesting ideas. But none of the buildings you're talking about would be able to, in your book, would be able to describe themselves as net zero, and yet you define them as environmental architecture. And I just perhaps wanted, and then you just also used the word, you described things as environmental in the broadest sense. So I thought perhaps we could start by you talking about how you understand and position in the environmental within architecture.
Yes. I think the way that I view this word is that, and I think I say somewhere in that book that, maybe a provocative statement, that all architecture of substance, from my perspective, is by definition environmental. By that, I think I mean that buildings stand in climates and they seek to modify that climate in order to create conditions within where human activity can take place, can even flourish. So in that sense, throughout its entire recorded and before its recorded history, building, maybe we shouldn't go into that distinction between what is architecture and what is a building, because we come down to bicycle sheds and Lincoln Cathedral if we're not careful. But one of the fundamental purposes of building is to provide shelter. And shelter is modifying environment. So in that sense, all architecture is environmental. But what engages me particularly is how that primitive, and of course Laugier comes to mind in terms of representation of the primitive hut as an environmental enclosure. I'm particularly interested in those architectures throughout history and to the present, where the form and materiality of the building are the primary means by which that transaction between outside and inside is organized.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So looking at the range of buildings in the environmental imagination, there's some slight differences between first and second editions. I'm certain you know. There are some extra pieces in second edition, and sadly a few pieces, a few architects were omitted in the second edition because of questions of space, length of the book, and so on. Mm-hmm. But the first edition ranges very. I like this, that from Sohn to Caesar. So I had architect beginning with S, and alphabetically from alto to Zumthor. Thank goodness for Zumthor, so we get the complete alphabet. But all of those architectures actually kind of the work of those architects essentially maintains that transaction where the form and materiality of the building are the primary elements of modifying climate. Mm. And it seems to me that in relation to the question of net zero, that is still the question at the heart of how we design net zero buildings. We minimize we control that transaction between in and out, primarily in order, of course, to reduce heat loss, in order to reduce the amount of heat we need to supply into buildings. Mm. In some cases, in some climates, of course, to control questions of excessive heat and therefore to avoid the need to cool buildings. But it seems to me, in the context of this whole debate about the environmental impact of buildings, the fundamental question to hold on to is that the fabric of buildings, their architecture, not to speak about the mechanical systems, is really a very recent arrival in the development of building as environmental objects. It is that kind of central question of the nature of the built piece of it that offers the clue to how we proceed towards these new objectives. I've from time to time suggested that if you can represent architecture conceptually, a building conceptually as a kind of equation, and you have a number of variables in your equation, and as circumstances change, you add a new variable. The variable of net zero is a new one to put into the equation of architecture, if I'm making any sense here. But that it doesn't fundamentally change the question. There are some people who say, well, it changes it completely, and we abandon all of that kind of earlier development and history of architecture, and we have to start afresh. But my feeling is that the answer to the future lies in that history, but transformed by engagement with a new question, and of course by the potentiality of new technologies, new material science, new understanding of all of these questions.
Yes. So,
can I say something about the house that I can see through the window of my study? When we built it in 1991, it was built as a passive solar house, but it was built, as I said earlier, as a house. That's what it is. It's a house. But it was built with U values of less than 0.2 for the entire envelope. It only has standard double glazing, triple glazing and selective coatings on glass
For how many square meters?
Every time I calculate it, I get a different answer. It's just under 100 square meters.
That's very good.
Yes, but very good at that time. But that's perhaps something we should set aside. But the point I'm making is, the house was high performance, not net zero. Of course, that wasn't on our agenda in 1991.
No,
that question. Reduction of energy consumption was in the interests of the planet. We were concerned about that. In the 1980s, I was a member of what was then called the European Passive Solar Working Group, which was a group of people from all the countries of Europe, 13 countries, how that's changed, that led to the production of the European Passive Solar Guide as a handbook to teach the profession how across Europe to design with energy saving in mind. So it's part of all of that movement.
So the idea that you seem to be expressing, so this comes to the first sort of provocation that I sent you, the idea that you seem to be suggesting, which I like a lot, by the way, is that whilst we do have technologies to mediate the environmental performance of the interiors of our buildings, the ideal would be to return to an architecture of pure enclosure unaided by mechanical systems. That would be the sort of the perfection of the art of architectural form and architectural making, as you described this. Sitting, drinking, having your breakfast this morning in your bay window without, when it's 3 degrees outside and you don't need heating on the inside.
Incidentally, in my dressing gown.
Oh well, there you go. It's a very different experience to my house, which is incredibly leaky. Very nice. So this idea is that, because you talk about it in the book, you talk about this idea of served and servant spaces within houses, and you within buildings, and you describe the way that technology and technological understanding has informed architecture a great deal. But still, I get the sense in the book and in the way that you describe these great pieces of architecture, and you see this very much in Sverre Fenn's work at Hedmark and perhaps also in Zumthor's work at Vals, and in Sohn's work where you start. The ideal would be to avoid or to forego mechanics. If you are going to use them, then use them architecturally, but the ideal is to not need them at all. Is that right? Am I right?
Well, I think, given the way in which we inhabit our buildings now, which are essentially 24/7, 365, might add that as well, for all sorts of reasons. That ideal is rarely realizable.
Yeah.
And certainly as a global proposition, not. You are sitting in Kent, I'm sitting in Cambridgeshire, and we have to remember there is a very different world beyond us, and these questions shouldn't be localized entirely, attractive though that might be. So I think for most modern purposes, even the level of a house, we occupy space totally differently now from that of our forebears. I've written a great deal about the arts and crafts movement, an arts and crafts house, a very purish one, say by Bailey Scott, who didn't like electricity in this earlier period, would be inhabited totally unlike a modern house, where people would simply use the main living space in the evenings. Now we disperse ourselves around our house. It depends how many members of the family are and so. So buildings require the form and fabric requires some mechanical assistance. But I think the point is to minimize the degree to which they need that mechanical assistance by calibrating the fabric to perform better than it has using historic methods. I'm for advanced methods in every respect, but it seems to me that we could abandon, we could achieve all of those objectives in terms of practicality by simply heating, lighting, ventilating rooms mechanically, cooling them if need be. You could have unwindowed boxes, and by mechanical services, we could fulfill many functions, whether it's living, whether it's working, whether it's entertainment. And of course, there are some buildings which are essentially that. The transformation of many art museums from wonderful day-lit spaces to mechanically serviced black boxes, mainly in the interests of the conservation of the works of art and their delicacy, their fragility, and so is an interesting instance of that. And maybe there are many good reasons why some buildings should be like that. But it does seem to me that indicates a kind of disconnection between all of that history of architecture.
Which is a history of us as well, isn't it?
Yes,
there's a sense in a way where, to me, a lot of this discussion about net zero adopts an incredibly technocratic kind of, or technologicalist kind of perspective, where the only answer is triple glazing and meter thick SIP panels, and there's no space in the discussion for the socio-cultural aspects of environment, which I find I find very depressing, actually. And what I've
also there is another dimension of this in that if the environment within the building is a product of a transaction between outside and inside, we're essentially filtering, a term I've used in the past, selecting those aspects of the external environment which are desirable to have in your house, such as a patch of sunlight, or bright natural light, a waft of gentle air from an open window, whatever it might be, even bird song from your garden entering the inside. If we eliminate all of those, we're depriving ourselves of a sensory connection with nature, which I think is very fundamental to human well-being.
Yes,
there's a great deal of work that goes on about these kind of questions now, which I've participated in to some small degree.
Also,
and so I mean, responding to your comment on this, about us as part of nature, there's a very interesting argument developing about how now humankind is beginning to realize that we are part of nature, against that old process of industrialization and mechanization, which has led us to think that we're separate from nature.
Yes. But I think...
And quite a lot of people are writing about that. I mean, there's a very interesting new book which I will reach for from my shelves, which I attended the online launch of the other evening, which is this book by Susanna Hagen, a very interesting writer, called The Revolution, Architecture and the Anthropocene.
Yeah.
Which is largely about those questions.
Yes. But I suppose my question also is to do with this idea that, and it comes back to this quote that you make about Louis Kahn's quote on Barragan, that the way that we produce architecture, we have to produce architecture that feels like what we intuitively understand to be building, to be architectural. So rather than just trying for it to actually be fully sustainable, a building has to correspond in some primitive way, in some profound philosophical, psychosocial, spiritual, perhaps even way, with some kind of inherent quality. So you can produce a net zero passive house. And I've seen a number of them in my time and gone through them, and they don't satisfy or don't appear to satisfy a kind of cultural yearning for what a building should be. So the buildings that you describe in your book, the way that you describe them, is really about communicating how these buildings correspond to this. You mentioned Laugier, this idea of the ideal, primitive, basic environment, and I think that that's a really interesting idea that you're trying to bring together these what seem to be competing and perhaps pulling apart spheres of the technological approach to architecture and environment, and then the people that, I suppose, only think about culture. I can't think of who that might be, but challenging, I suppose, the ecotechnic approach by imbuing it with a cultural language, a cultural historical language.
I think, yes, I'm wondering how to respond to that, apart from simply agreeing with you.
You can. I don't suppose there is. I'm just trying to kind of pick around in the idea of what I'm getting from your work, because I think what you do, what this book does, and what is so important about it, is sort of justifying, in a way, the great modernists. Increasingly, they're slung aside as being remnants of colonialism or remnants of imperialism or unenvironmentally sound. And I like the way you habilitate them or rehabilitate them into a kind of contemporary discourse around sustainability and environment.
I mean, in a way, to do, I think somewhere in one of your provocations, you allude to this. I mean, I don't really write about great modernists in the kind of central sense of this. I mean, the only modernists in the strict sense are of course, Corbusier and Mies in an essay which compares and contrasts in a way their different approaches to questions of environment in this broad sense which I attach to the term. And I think you make in your provocations a very interesting kind of challenge to me to read this question of the other tradition, which I think you correctly kind of suggest is where my heart lies, as opposed to, as it were, that kind of canonical modernism those pioneers. Well, what the Smithsons later in that amazing edition of architectural design called the heroic period.
Yes.
But then we have we have this notion of the other, which comes from Sandy Wilson's book, The Other Tradition of Modern Architecture. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is a kind of postcode connection there. It's the Cambridge connection, and that, I find that book a very compelling book. Mm. But he kind of grows out of a kind of common ground. When I was at Manchester in the 50s and 60s, in a way, that was a period still of the architectural heroes as students. Long before Smithsons wrote that wonderful thing, made that suggestion of the heroic. My recollection is the way there were two. We were taught as modernists. There was a presupposition of architecture education in the 50s that was modern architecture was what there was, and it addressed questions that were important in society. There was still a sense of post-war reconstruction. There was a job to be done. There was housing to be built. There were schools to be built. My studio projects were housing and schools and socially necessary projects of that kind. Mm. My final design thesis eventually was an opera house, and therein lies many other stories. But that was still. But this idea of modern architecture, and the book that I read before I became a student. When I told my mother at the age of 14, I decided I was going to be an architect for some reason. The next day, I came home from school, and there on the kitchen table was a brown paper bag in which was a book. And she'd been out to buy it to one of the only two bookshops in my hometown, north of England, and she bought the only book on architecture they had, which was J.N. Richards' Introduction to Modern Architecture, which kind of defined me before I went to architecture school. So we were modernists, and to some extent, you had a choice of what kind of modernist you were to be, and you had Le Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe. Mm-hmm. And I decided I was a Corbusian. Probably in my second year, I did a project for a school with a school hall with a south wall not uninfluenced by Ronchamp, which had just been published. That little red book on Ronchamp, I think, is 1957 now. It's first issue in 56. And that's how the school worked. And I had friends who were doing Miesian buildings. Mm. I remember a little flutter with Richard Neutra for some reason.
I did too.
Yeah, I thought Neutra is deeply interesting, but I never really addressed him in my research. But then I came to Cambridge. I then graduated and worked in practice in Manchester. Then decided there was more to architecture than I was discovering in a busy, fairly big practice in Manchester. Enjoyable that was in many, many ways. And I then found an opportunity to come to Cambridge to do research on daylight, about which I knew very little. But the school actually advertised for a research assistant in the AJ. And I wrote a letter to Leslie Martin, who invited me to come to talk to him. Also a Mancunian, remember, which may or may not be relevant. And I was given the job to come and study daylight, making abstract models of built forms and studying them under an artificial sky which stood in the back garden of the school. But here, of course, I then encountered that other tradition. Leslie was head of school. Sandy Wilson was a lecturer. Harvey Court in Key's College was built. People were talking about Aalto. One of the things I did in my daylighting research, Leslie and Sandy had just finished the Manor Road Libraries in Oxford, which I think is a remarkable building, which had been designed using model studies in that artificial sky before I arrived. And when it was finished, I went there with my daylighting meters and measured the daylighting levels in the building to compare with the model studies. So I spent days in that building. So this was my exposure to the other tradition. In the built examples by Leslie's office and his associates. And of course, hearing people talk about Aalto. And that developed. And then Asplund was part of the conversation. Then Peter Blundell-Jones joined the department as assistant lecturer. By that time, I became a lecturer, and Peter was talking about Sharoon and Asplund and so on. There was a whole conversation. And so this whole world of that kind of architecture, that other tradition, became, appealed to me. I recognized how different it was in various ways from the modern masters. There was the book, you probably know the book, but very influential book, probably published in the 50s by Peter Blake, not the painter, called Master Builders, which was Corb, Mies, and Wright. It was always present. There was this trinity, but somehow, to my generation of students, certainly in Manchester Art School in those days, Wright was interesting, but it wasn't useful for some reason.
Well, he was domestic, wasn't he?
Well, late buildings, of course. We knew about the Guggenheim. We would try to see the Guggenheim in some relation to, say, Rochon, in fluid form and so on. But Wright was there, but kind of not useful. We wanted to attach ourselves to a figure and their work that in some way kind of was useful to what we were trying to do in the studio, in addressing those kind of projects which we were issued.
Yes. Peter Blundell-Jones was my dissertation supervisor at Sheffield.
Yes. And Peter was a great friend and a great loss, of course.
Oh, he was a wonderful man. Absolutely amazing. And funnily enough, to go full circle, my dissertation was on Lincoln Cathedral. So there you go. So you've mentioned Lincoln Cathedral.
Yes.
But no, he was an extraordinarily wonderful scholar. That's a lovely description, a lovely story you tell about that hopeful moment, and the emergence of a kind of, I suppose, a technical analysis of the environmental qualities of architecture, which you're part of, and your book kind of is part of as well. But in all of it, again, to come back to the second provocation I sent to you, so this idea of dwellingness, I call it dwellingness, that great buildings and these buildings that you're interpreting in the book focuses on how they produce sort of sense of place and identity. So how does technology and how does the engagement with the environmental context produce a sense of place and identity? And it is a big challenge, isn't it, for modernist architecture? So the greats, you mentioned the three greats, and as you say, Frank Lloyd Wright sort of sits to the side of the two, Mies and Le Corbusier. There is this problem that we still wrestle with, which is this kind of universalizing quality of modernism. And the way that technology is a universal thing. And the kind of undergirding democratic zeal, emancipatory zeal of modernism is universalist as well. And then this need to be very contextual, very responsive to the environment, very responsive to the material traditions and the historical traditions. And how do you feel, I suppose, that those things... Is it possible, I suppose, to square that circle? Is it possible to be both modern and indigenous, local?
Well,
or do we have to accept that architecture just can't really do it, but it can make a good shot at it, it can do its best, but it's not really a framework for doing that?
Oh. I'm thinking it's an absolutely essential point, of course, and it comes back to this distinction between what I might call high modernism and its universalist tendency.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that statement of Corbusier in the Buenos Aires lectures, we will build one house for all climates, is which of course he never did.
No.
If you study his domestic designs, they're beautifully adapted to their specific milieu, word he liked to use for environment. Of course, being French, he would do that. But that suggestion it's fully borne out. I mean, the great triumph of that line of thought in modernist architecture is the glass skyscraper, which of course exists in opposition to the diversity of climates. It exists in every large city on the planet for the relatively banal use of office functions, whatever they might be, and of course it profoundly contradicts the notion of net zero. But it's the most. I'm a fellow of Darwin College in Cambridge, and so Darwinism and evolution, used metaphorically even in reference to architecture, is quite attractive. If you're talking about survival of the fittest in terms of number of instances of a particular type, that is it. But how interesting is that, really? How interesting is it, in the context of a wider discussion of the potentiality of architecture?
Yeah.
It's banal, but it's successful, isn't it?
It is, yes. It's like Walt Disney.
Yeah, and maybe other building types. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I drove to Milton Keynes for the first time in a long time, and you drive. As you approach Milton Keynes, you drive for about 5 miles, surrounded by big sheds with Amazon and other names written on them, and they're buildings. But it begs many questions in terms of this question of architecture. I mean, if we look at the word environment, and in the book, I try to elaborate what that word, and I do this little kind of, I think I call it terminological reflections subsection, and I expand the word, looking for synonyms which are character, atmosphere. Incidentally, of course, Peter Zumthor wrote a little book called Atmosphere, about the same time as the first edition of the Environmental Imagination was published. Another synonym, tone, mood, and then milieu.
Yeah.
And environment is more. It's a difficult word because it has all sorts of meanings. But in order to kind of tie it down, in relation to the particular questions of architecture I'm trying to explore. I had to kind of give it these additional nuances.
Mm.
And when you have that expanded definition, then the architectural possibilities open up for you. It seems to me.
Yeah, I noticed this idea of ambience, you picking out the word ambience, character, atmospheres. I wrote it down. I was again reading through this morning. And I thought that was really good, expanding the scope of this word. Environment is it's sort of like a juggernaut word, isn't it? It sort of crushes through everything and actually has very little nuance or subtlety to it. And in a way that's good. It can be applied to a lot of context, but in another way, it's such a big word, it's such an opaque word, that anybody can talk about environmental architecture, because the word can take any amount of battering. But if you talk about atmosphere or ambiance, then you're refining the idea.
That's precisely the point. Yes, yes, that's precisely the point. I mean, coming back to this question, the distinction between the universal and the specific. I mean, when we come to the, in quotes, other tradition, I think it's not insignificant that many of those architects, by no means all, but many of them, are Nordic. Begin with Aalto, Asplund, we move to Levelands, we get Fehn, and when you are in a northern climate, more northern than bland, agreeable Cambridge, even 52 degrees north of the equator, you go to the Nordic countries, the difference between seasons, the difference between summer and winter is so extreme that I think, it's very probably almost impossible for an architect, certainly in the early and middle years of the 20th century, to operate without inherently being alert to the conditions of the climate in which you're placing your buildings. Yeah, and I think some of the explanation for that distinction between between those architects and, say, Le Corbusier working out of Paris and moving slightly south. I think wherever you are in France, even if you're in the north, you have a sense that the bottom of that country, its feet are in the Mediterranean, with kind of conditions and tempers, your sense of the context within which you're working, and there is a view. It's very reasonable to suggest that even Villa Savoye is a Mediterranean building, even though the climate of Paris is quite different, but it's totally different from the conditions that apply in the Nordic countries. I mean, to compare Savoye or Gage with the Villa Maria is really interesting.
Yes,
and again, in the essay on the other tradition in the book, I juxtapose at the outset that wonderful Corbusian drawing that is incised in the shuttering of the concrete at the Unité in Marseille, of showing the sun paths of winter and summer against a cross section of the building, with Aalto's beautiful drawing preparatory to the Vaipuri Library of what he calls magical landscapes with many suns. And that established, I think, something of a distinction between the kind of wonderful platonicness of Corbusier's representation of the situation of his building and Aalto's other kind of consciousness and these northern latitudes. the sun is different. This universal of the sun within which we all under which we all operate. It is perceived totally differently in those two representations of it by these architects.
Yes. I think it's really, really beautiful description of it. I've not had the pleasure of going to any Nordic countries, actually, for one reason or another. So it all exists only in my imagination still, which is quite nice in a way. It's sort of like meeting your heroes. It's always disappointing.
Part of my research for this book, I spent over a week in Finland in December 2003. When the first time I'd been that far north, it's 62 degrees north, 10 degrees of latitude north of Cambridge. It's hugely different.
Yeah.
And on another visit in around about the spring equinox, on my visit to Villa Maria, I understood on a sunny day, thank goodness. I understood how you could have that square pavilion, which essentially represents a corner space of that building. How it could be 9 meters deep and still be light. Yeah. And it's because the sun is up above the horizon for a long part of the day at the equinox, half of the day, and it's low in the sky. It penetrates right deeply into the space and across it in a way that it doesn't 10 degrees further south as we are. And this difference, the geometry of the sun in a place is so fundamental.
I wonder with this, though, that the way, again, something that I picked up in your book and the way that you're describing it now, it's almost as if, and then you talking about the way that working with Leslie Martin and Sandy Wilson and the kind of, it seems to me that they sort of intuitively understood their context. It's like you were saying about the France intuitively understanding that its feet are in the Mediterranean. And a French architect of quality like Corbe would therefore know how to do French architecture. It would be inherent to the, because of cultural reading and cultural discourse and just the way that they're raised and so on. And I wonder whether with these great, Aalto and Asplund and people like that, whether there was a real consciousness, like a measuring and a kind of technical approach to the way that they designed, or if it was an intuitive response to understood vernacular forms. I don't know how we could go about proving that one way or another. I suppose there would be documentation of their measuring of this stuff.
I think it's this is thinking out loud. No. A risky business. But I think that generation, not just of architects, but of everybody, and even people of my generation. I was born just before the Second World War. We lived lives where we were much more in connection with the variability of climate. I grew up in a house with no central heating. Mm-hmm. And we had a living room with a fire, and we were all in there. Now, of course, we can temper every space of the building. Maybe, of course, in response to net zero, we reconsider other ways in which we inhabit space. But the point I'm trying to make is that just by everyday experience, one was more in contact with nature. The buildings in which Corbusier and Aalto grew up We're very, because Corbusier was an urbanist. He lived. He was a Parisian. Aalto grew up in Jyväskylä. His father was a land surveyor. There are stories in Schilt's big, wonderful 3-volume biography of Aalto. Aalto, as a schoolboy, going in the school holidays, traveling around Finland with his father. His father did his work, encountering that landscape, that climate at all seasons. Yeah, you have I think people had a much greater awareness of the variability of climate. We get into our cars now. Everybody has one. They have climate control. We can live in a kind of controlled environment all of our life. I mean, I remember the first time I went to the equator. I went to Kuala Lumpur in January. I left cold England. I got out of the airport coach at Heathrow into an air-conditioned building. I went in an air-conditioned 747, landed at Kuala Lumpur, got to an air-conditioned taxi, which took me to my air-conditioned hotel. And I've been in the same temperature range all that way.
Yeah.
Then I arrived late at night. Next morning, I stepped out of the front of the hotel and nearly fell over with 30-something degrees and heat and 98% relative humidity.
Yeah.
And of course, I got into an air-conditioned taxi. Went to see Ken Yang in his air-conditioned office. But yeah, so we can live without any connection.
Yeah.
And I think that generation of architects are very deeply connected, and I think and that's a connection I sense. I go around on a bicycle just about still. I live in this quasi-passive solar house, which I can see again. The sun's come out again. It will be beautifully warm with no heat on in that main space. I mean, I think these architects whose work I've written about, from Sohn to Zumthor, chronologically and in the alphabet. They're all buildings which kind of exhibit that kind of sensibility to the potential of responding to this complex situation and bringing it into your building, and maintaining a sense of awareness between in and out. I mean, there's a wonderful drawing which I reproduced in the book by Zumthor of the Bregenz Kunsthaus, which you all might see as a kind of bunker. It's a glass building which is then solid within. But there's a very early drawing he made, which is a plan of the building, which shows the sun coming. The building is almost exactly orientated on the cardinal points. It has south and east, the west and the north facade. And he makes a little drawing in yellow crayon, which is monochrome in the book, sadly, which shows sun from the south, yellow light as arrows, yellow arrows, and from the east and from the west, and none from the north. And it's fantastically telling about how alert, in designing an art museum with this need to protect the artworks within, but how he represents that engagement with this wonderful, universal but variable quality of the sun around a building.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really, really interesting. it's what I like about your discussion about the other moderns, really, is the way that they kind of, and I was talking to Alan Powers about it on this podcast as well, about sort of reinterpreting or finding new ways of looking at modernism, and I think that's what your book does. Actually, it's a really beautiful way of understanding that contextual, the profound contextual knowledge that these great architects had, and it's why their architecture is great, because it is so, and particularly for me. So we've mentioned Frank Lloyd Wright, and I called his work domestic, and that's kind of what his great, other than the swirly building in New York, which is great fun, and I've been up it, and it's a marvelous piece of urbanism. But his architecture is fundamentally suburban, I think. Perhaps it has a suburban appeal to it, which I quite like. And I don't want to talk about this too much, but one of the things that's popped into my head is that there's this differential. You talked about Corbusier as a Parisian, that is to say, an urban man, and then you talked about Aalto as a kind of rural man, and I wonder whether that's had a big influence on the way that their architecture emerged as well, with Corbusier coming up with kind of universalist ideas which are very metropolitan in their kind of identity. Anyway, but I just wanted to go on to the other book that I got sent from your publishers, The Architectural Academy, which is wonderful. Again, collection of essays, and
there's an Aalto image on the front cover.
Yes, yeah, it's really nice. You write in there that the division of the discipline of architecture into distinct components of art or science, or architecture and building, is, I think you suggest, sort of erroneous, problematic. And what your book does is it seeks to cross that divide. And you describe the way in which great architects have synthesized the two, which is possibly where the academic architect comes in, and your role as an academician and a practitioner is so interesting. But you also say that this objectivity is a way of getting past subjectivity. So this kind of analysis of fundamental, as to quote, fundamental programmatic questions and the use of rational procedures is a way of resisting the dangers of subjectivity and stylism. And I wondered, and the question I asked you is this always true? And are there architects and architectures that are still good despite not doing this? That are just kind of good because they're just great shapes or wonderful to look at?
Yes. I think I'm trying to answer this. I think it relates to the distinction I make in the subtitle to the environmental imagination between techniques and poetics. There's something, there's a parallel here between the objectivity. And I think, and that follows from, there's a wonderful statement by Louis Kahn, which I use as the epigram to the book, about the relationship between the measurable and the unmeasurable. Yeah. And that science should realize that what it's really trying to understand is the unmeasurable. Mm-hmm. And that's what it really matters. So, and I'm intrigued in this relationship between what we can do measurably, objectively, technically, and all of which are terms which are essential in the realization of architecture. Architecture is a technical enterprise. We have materials, we have mechanical systems now. We have all that kit of parts from which we make buildings, all of which are nowadays developed by methods of calculation. And of course, one of the other great transformations between what we've been talking about most of this morning and present day practice is digitization. Mm-hmm. Another whole conversation which we better not try to stumble towards. But yeah, and since I have built, not enough perhaps, but built, and I love the process of building, and I love making working drawings, and I love being on site and speaking with consultants in the office and working with contractors on site. It's an essential part of the whole process. But what I identify as where architecture is not found there. It comes from somewhere else, and this is why I use the word imagination. And it's the unmeasurable. It's Kahn's unmeasurable where architecture is found, not in the measurable of technique, or techniques, or any of the variables of that word. I mean, a study that influenced me a great deal when thinking about this was Kenneth Frampton's Studies in Tectonic Culture, which I think the subtitle is Poetics of Construction in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I think in that book, Ken was kind of addressing the same kind of questions. And I think I refer to it in the introduction to the environmental imagination as something which influenced me. I had a wonderful, in the late 80s, early 90s, for 3 consecutive years, I taught at a summer school at Gladio Institute in Vicenza with Ken Frampton, amongst others. And one day, Ken and I went by train from Vicenza to Verona to visit Scarpa's Banco Popolare. That was a wonderful day, you can imagine. And it was a time when he was writing the book, and that building is in the book, and it's also in my book. So this is a kind of key question that, and the specific point you raise about objectivity. I feel, and I think that in the architectures I find interesting and try to write about, that all of those architects engage with these questions of technique as the foundation of the poetics that they realize in their buildings. In this new book, I quote this wonderful statement by Francis Bacon, painter, not philosopher, and where he wrote, "Real imagination is technical imagination." He's writing about a painting. It is a search for the technique to trap the object at a given moment. Then the technique and the object become inseparable. The object is the technique, and the technique is the object. I find that absolutely compelling. And I think, it is transferable from the realm of fine art, from painting to architecture. And again, I don't think it's something, that these architects I'm interested in consciously think about. It's inherent in the way in which they think and they work, in conceiving their buildings. And it is quite separate, I think, from what we might call formalist or stylist. bases from which you might make buildings. I quite like some of those objects. One of the problems with some of those objects, I think we should name no names, perhaps, but when you enter them, I get none of those. Rarely find, I wouldn't say never ever, I think that's too absolute, but I don't find these qualities of environments, but all those synonyms for environment, atmosphere, ambience, media, I don't find them there. I find they're not, many of those architects who make those wonderful objects aren't interested in those questions. They're not where they begin, and they're not where they end often.
Mm. It's a very, very good point. That's a very, very interesting way of differentiating them. I suppose in a way there's a timelessness about some of the work that you're describing which supersedes or goes beyond the rather limited universal qualities of of high modernism or even contemporary object architects, which I think is really, really wonderful. Well, I think that's a lovely point to stop on. I've greatly enjoyed talking to you.
I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very, very much.
I've enjoyed looking at your insulation in your loft.
It doesn't do much. You
must find that image of. I will try to find the image of Leverance's lair and send it to you.
I would like that very much. It's a wonderful book, and it's been a delight to talk to you actually, and to hear your generosity engaging with my, I suppose, somewhat incoherent line of questioning. But I think there's so much richness in what you've written, and it's very inspiring. So I'm very grateful. Really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
That was marvellous. Thank you to Dean for the great conversation and for being so game. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to the 2 books we were discussing, and for links to Dean's academic profile, and to the talk he's giving online on the 27th of April as part of the Daylight in Architecture programme. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share. A is for Architecture with your pals. Cheers.